Okay, let's go.
How would you contrast Indian cinema with global cinema beyond the distinct use of this music and dance sequences? Like considering the diverse themes and focus points of regional cinema within India, and how this influences India's positioning in international film landscape.
Um, okay, great question. I mean, there's a lot to it. Uh, in short, I think your question is contrasting Indian cinema with world cinema, Western cinema. But also in your question, you introduced an important point, which is that there's regional cinema within Indian cinema. So starting with that, Indian cinema, as you mentioned, is not a monolith. So we sometimes talk about European cinema because it tends to have a kind of a high level of sophistication. But the fact is, Spanish culture is as different from Polish culture as I don't know Gujarati and Tamil, right? So you almost have in India kind of Europe, right? A United States of Europe, United States of India, in that each of the regions has country level regional differences that we would normally just say, that's like French cinema. So we know when we say, oh, it's a Punjabi movie, bam, 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 we already know. As you would without trying to be stereotypical, if I said it's a, so French film from the 1960s, I'll go bam, 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 and I'll just know certain things about it. But you're one country and you have all that diversity. So you're making 2,000 movies a year. And that's probably even increasing. Those are 2,000 that actually get seen in some way. It's probably increasing now with digital technology. But that's far, far more than even Hollywood. It's about 300 movies a year. So it's far more than anywhere else and far more diverse. So what you actually have is the development of each region. And each region, you wouldn't compare, how is Bengali cinema compared to Hollywood? But you could. And I'd like to just pause this concept here for a second. When we talk about regional, I think it's interesting to point out that sometimes a movie works at the regional level, but not nationally. So, for example, Such a Day was not particularly successful across all of India. There are, actually many famous, Malayalam films which are fantastic in Kerala, but not particularly successful outside of that. You can go to any of the regions, Assamese or Tamil or any of these, and that holds true. And yet sometimes these regionally successful movies play abroad and play abroad quite well. And I think that's a very interesting thing that something can play regionally, can play nationally, can play internationally. And it may be that there's something that plays internationally but doesn't play at all in India. There's been festival movies like Ship of Theseus, for example, did very well abroad. Even something like Irfan Khan and Nimrat Kaur in Lunchbox, I think a lot of Indian audiences thought it was okay, but it wasn't like Sholay, right? And Sholay, as wonderful it is, wasn't particularly an international hit. So it's weird to compare, right? And not all American movies are successful in America or internationally. So I think I have a kind of a framework to think about this, which is that actually it's almost like cultures, or it's actually like even cities. In India, you might have a city like Bangalore. So Bangalore is very significant, very influential, very powerful, and very central city on a regional basis. But nationally, doesn't have that much of an impact on politics. It doesn't have a national influence the way, say, Delhi does, or to some extent even Mumbai. It has a huge impact at the regional level, not so much national. National, it's kind of undervalued, underappreciated, really. But then you go to the global, and Bangalore has a much more significant impact internationally than Delhi does, actually. So a city can play at different levels. I would say, for example, Mumbai is not particularly significant internationally. Not yet. It's growing, but it's not yet. But it's tremendously important nationally. It's incredibly important for the west coast of India. So you can have different things. And so now some of the things happen with movies, where if you're, let's say, a Hindi movie and you know you're going to go for a kind of a North Indian, kind of a pan-Indian approach, you can play to the domestic audience. And you can indulge in the domestic audience in a way that, I would say indulge meaning you're going to have the guys, the couple running around the trees, and the audience wants those solid things. And I think for decades, the Hindi Bollywood industry gave the audiences what they wanted, which is, music will come in the movie, we'll have this, we'll have that, we'll have the comment, the whole masala, the whole package, which is great. But that fulfilled a kind of a national audience without any care in the world about how it played in Belgium, right? Okay, that's fine, that's fine. But now look at somebody like Satyajit Ray. Satyajit Ray and many other kind of filmmakers, he's probably the most famous example in this category. He made movies which were, beloved by Bengali audiences and regionally very significant. Didn't particularly play to the audience nationally, but he was touching universals. And when you touch universals, then you don't have to play for an audience. It will find an audience. And this is not just true for Satyajit Ray. You find Tamil movies are very much successful in, say, Japan. They find things connecting. There's an expression in Hollywood for this, actually. The more local, the more universal. So if you're making a movie in South America about a postman who delivers mail to an illiterate villager, and the illiterate villager is getting love letters, and the postman has to read the letters to him, that will play in Bihar. Because if that is a true thing, and actually is a real movie, it's based on a poet who had a job as a postman, and he would tell these stories to the villager who was illiterate. And that story, if it's done well, even though it's in Spanish and it's in it's taking place in, I think, Argentina, wherever it is, it will resonate on a universal basis. So if you go too much for your domestic audience, or you go too much for the international audience even, you might lose the other three. So as an artist, I would say, don't focus that much. Just kind of be true to what you're doing. And India has done that much better than a lot of other cinemas, which have I don't want to say they've sold out, but they've become a lot more Americanized. There's a lot of foreign films that are trying to copy America. And India is still, for the most part, still true to its own values, its own audiences, its own sense of humor, its own kind of things like that. So you can never compare, art. You shouldn't compare. But I would say that the development in India is actually at a very interesting point, because the regional cinemas are all going very strong. And now you have the rise of, not since like Sholay or very few examples here and there, but the rise of the pan-Indian movement, the pan-Indian movie. And this mirrors politics. If you go back to, before Modi, before 2014, nobody voted for the prime minister. You always voted locally. You always voted regionally. You voted for your MP, your MLA, and then they would go off to Delhi and they would sit in the Lok Sabha and they would figure out the Congress and the party politics and figure out who would be the prime minister. But around 2014, Indians began to think, still of course regionally, but they started to think, well, if I vote for this party, who's going to be the prime minister of India at a national level actually is going to influence how I vote. So now you have, although I speak a regional language, although I'm local in terms of my politics, in terms of getting things done and the potholes on my street, I am now thinking as a nation in a kind of pan-Indian political way. And that kind of thinking gives rise to the beginning of the pan-Indian movies, where they're actually built from scratch now, where a movie will be dubbed in 5 languages, and that is the business model. So we're now at that stage where India has its own kind of pan-Indian cinema. And now the next hurdle was, can it make that, like Hollywood did, accessible to a global audience? Sometimes it's happening. Triple R did pretty well, but I think there'll be more and more of that, especially as visual effects become more affordable and technology decreases. There will be a more, how do you put it, more spectacular cinema coming out of India, and that'll be just more accessible for global audiences.